The United States military buildup in the Caribbean is not about Venezuelan narco trafficking. It's about an emerging threat to the economic heart of the United States. Now, if that sounds like a reach, just stay with me, because to understand why this matters, you need to understand the geography that built America. Now, every serious empire grew on a river. The Egyptians didn't build a kingdom in the desert, they built one on the Nile, the original economic highway that carried grain and stone across the land. And the first cities in Mesopotamia rose on the Tigris and the Euphrates. Floodplains became farmland and trade routes connected continents. China's dynasties stood on the back of the Yellow River. It fed the population and it fed the bureaucracy. And Europe repeated this pattern. Rome on the Tiber, France on the Seine, Germany on the Rhine, Russia on the Volga, all of them scaled because rivers moved more goods at lower cost than any road network ever could. They do more than nourish the soil. They knit whole economies together long before highways, rail lines, and container ships even existed. Now, the Mississippi River is the modern giant in this story. It is the Nile, the Rhine, and the Yellow combined, but larger, more industrial, and plugged straight into global markets through the Gulf of Mexico. So for the United States, every major inland artery flows into it. The Missouri River, the Ohio River, the Arkansas, the Tennessee rivers. Together, they form the largest navigable inland waterway network on Earth, draining about 41% of the continental United States. And as a consequence, more than 500 million tons of cargo move down that system every single year. That's grain from Iowa, soybeans from Illinois, coal from Kentucky, chemicals from the refineries that line the river's industrial corridor. Now look, river barges are slow, they're boring, but they are incredibly cheap. A ton of cargo moved by barge costs about 1/10 the price if you were to move that cargo by rail or truck. The cost advantage is the reason the United States is still one of the world's largest and most efficient agricultural exporters. More than 60% of American grain exports begin on a barge in the Midwest and end at a deep water port in Louisiana. But the river is actually only half of this story. The real pressure point is where the Mississippi meets the sea, the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf is where American industry hits the open ocean, but it is also the center of U.S. energy production and refining. Let's have a look at these numbers. 47% of U.S. refining capacity sits on the Gulf. 20% of U.S. crude oil production comes from offshore platforms in the Gulf. Nearly 100% of LNG export terminals are in Texas and Louisiana on the Gulf Coast. Gulf refineries process more than 10 million barrels per day of crude into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and petrochemicals. The Gulf handles half of all U.S. waterborne commerce by tonnage. And this includes oil imports that are refined and then shipped to Europe or Latin America. All of this adds up to one thing. The Gulf of Mexico is an extraordinary concentration of risk. More than 4,000 platforms, pipelines, refineries, and export terminals cluster along the coasts of Texas and Louisiana, and they form the most valuable and most critical energy infrastructure anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, all within a 200-mile radius. From a military perspective, this is both a strength and a vulnerability. Now, it's a strength because the U.S. can defend it efficiently, right? Coast Guard assets run constant overwatch on shipping lanes and offshore platforms. And the Navy supports the region with destroyers, cutters, and submarines, and patrol aircraft operating out of Key West, Mayport, and Pascagoula. But it's a vulnerability because any adversary that gains a foothold in the Caribbean can threaten the entire system. They don't need to invade. They only need proximity. Close enough to carry out surveillance, close enough to position anti-ship missiles, close enough to lay sea mines or attack port infrastructure. Now, with that context, we can return to the question at hand. Why has the United States assembled the largest military presence in the Caribbean since the 1990s? And the official story is simple. Venezuela is a narco state. President Maduro is corrupt. The United States is cracking down on drug flows. Now, this narrative is convenient, but it's not true. Fentanyl, the drug responsible for the most U.S. overdose deaths, comes almost entirely from Mexico with precursor chemicals from China. Cocaine entering the United States is overwhelmingly produced in Colombia and trafficked through Central America and Mexico. Venezuela plays a secondary route at best, with no evidence that it's a major pipeline into the United States. Both the UN and US-owned government data shows Venezuela's share of US drug flows is more or less a rounding error when compared to Mexico, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, and none of the core substances driving the US drug crisis originate in Venezuela in any meaningful quantities. There is no empirical basis to call it a major narco state. Yet, the United States deployed the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. Now, this means 5 destroyers, 1 cruiser, 70 aircraft, an amphibious ready group carrying the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, a nuclear attack submarine, and the Special Operations Mothership Ocean Trader. It's reactivated bases in Puerto Rico and added F-35s, patrol aircraft, Ospreys, heavy lift helicopters, MQ-9 Reapers, and robotic air-to-surface missile systems. About 15,000 personnel, more than a dozen warships. This is the most concentrated show of American power in nearly 30 years. So we have to ask, if it's not about drugs, what's it about? Now, the answer, from my perspective, appears a few months before this buildup. In March of 2025, Russia signed a military cooperation agreement with Cuba that had just been ratified by the State Duma. Now, this treaty provides a framework for future military cooperation. That means joint training, arms supplies, and potential revival of Russian military facilities on the island of Cuba, including signal and intelligence sites. Now, Russian analysts describe this move as symmetrical retaliation for the long-range weapons the U.S. sent to Ukraine. They noted that the agreement could, in principle, allow deployment of any offensive system that both the Cuban and the Russian governments approve. That was in March, and then came June. Russian Navy ships and a Yasin M-class guided missile nuclear submarine entered Cuban territorial waters 90 miles from the United States. Now, this is not a small detail. Cuba sits at the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico like a cork in a bottle. Every major shipping route that feeds America's Gulf Coast, every tanker carrying LNG exports, every container ship bound for Houston or New Orleans, every naval vessel entering or leaving bases from Pensacola to Corpus Christi pass within Cuba's effective range. Cuba is less than 500 miles from New Orleans and less than 300 miles from the Florida Keys. Now, that proximity compresses American reaction time to almost zero. A cruise missile launched from Cuban waters could hit critical Gulf infrastructure in minutes. And this is why Cuba has never been treated like any other Latin American state that happens to align with Moscow or Beijing. The issue is not ideology. The issue is geography. So let me ask you, what makes more sense? The United States deployed the largest force in a generation to chase a few smugglers and fishing boats? Or that Washington is responding to the sudden arrival of Russian naval power next to the single most significant vulnerability in the American economy? Now, after all of this, the next question should be obvious. Who is actually hustling who? The United States may be hustling us by pointing at Venezuela to head fake from the real threat in the Gulf. But Russia might be running its own version of the Kansas City Shuffle. Pulling American eyes to the Gulf opens up opportunities elsewhere for Russia and, more likely, her allies. That's all for this week. Now, if you enjoy my content, this is the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds and conversations in geopolitics and finance. We publish twice every week. If you like what I do me a favor, hit subscribe, click that like button, and most importantly, share this video with a friend. Now, if you are somebody who invests or wants to invest in the mining sector, I host my annual conference this January 25th and 26th in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's called the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference. And this year, we anticipate over 11,000 investors to attend. I fly in about 100 keynote speakers from all over the world, individuals like Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Poor Dad, Danielle DiMartino Booth, David Rosenberg, Rick Rule, Andy Sheckman, Nomi Prinz, and dozens more to take one of 6 stages for what has become the Super Bowl of the mining industry, the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference. Get your tickets now at vricmedia.com. And if you want to meet Mr. Kiyosaki, Mr. Rule, Nomi Prinz, Danielle DiMartino Booth, any of these personalities, be sure to grab yourself a VIP ticket, which gives you exclusive behind the scenes access, including an invitation to the very coveted keynote speakers cocktail party. That's all for today. I will see you next week.